Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short audio presentation, we're going to talk about social entrepreneurship. We'll understand a little bit about the phenomena of social entrepreneurship and talk about the types of social entrepreneurial ventures. We'll briefly touch on capital markets and stakeholders, and then try to put entrepreneurship into a more global context. So social entrepreneurship, broadly speaking, is leveraging the skills, capabilities, processes, and structures to address problems other than profit maximization. Now, that's not to say that social entrepreneurial ventures can't generate profits or that social entrepreneurs aren't motivated to make money. But part of social entrepreneurship is trying to address social problems or environmental problems or other unsolved problems unrelated specifically to making cash. Many examples of social entrepreneurship are trying to tackle what we like to call wicked problems. Wicked problems don't have a single, simple solution. Good examples are things like the rich-poor gap, social inequality, access to health care, and so on. I want to make a personal note about social entrepreneurship, which is really not part of your textbook or specific to the course in itself. When Jerry George and I finished writing our second book, Models of Opportunity, we wrapped up by talking about the power of entrepreneurial action in the context of solving problems other than simply maximizing profits. And we talked about the hope that we had that many entrepreneurs were choosing to take on these kinds of challenges either in addition to or instead of traditional profit maximization. And I still very much believe that that's one of the most powerful things about entrepreneurship is its ability to solve problems. The issue here is that not everyone agrees that entrepreneurship should be used to solve social problems, and of course people disagree about what exactly a social problem is. And so for every American who happens to think that gun control is an issue that needs to be addressed in order to avoid things like school shootings, there are other Americans who believe, for example, that the right to own a gun is enshrined in the Constitution, and therefore it's part of a social responsibility to own guns. And we need to be careful in our classroom context about how we approach these kinds of challenges. Some of the problems that the world faces are factual in nature. And to the extent that as you think about what you want to accomplish, you can focus on recognizing what those facts are based on science and thinking about where you can have an impact, then I encourage you to do so. And I encourage you to see social entrepreneurship as a tool to be employed towards making the world a fundamentally better place. But this is a personal perspective. I hope that you'll recognize it as a personal perspective. To the extent it's useful to you, fantastic. If it's not useful to you, it's not strictly part of the course. So the textbook provides a typology of social ventures, which is interesting because, of course, one quadrant of the typology is perhaps what we'd not call a social venture, a traditional for-profit venture. The two categories the textbook provides are the venture mission, which can be either economic or social, and the primary market impact, which also can be either economic or social. And then the textbook also offers up this idea that you could also have a hybrid, which is sort of doesn't fully fit into any one of these categories. I think that that's a little bit of a dangerous place to start because, of course, then there's a natural reaction to classify every venture as a hybrid venture because it has a little bit of social venture mission and a little bit of primary market impact on the social side. And so then everything ends up being a hybrid venture. Regardless, this is to me a useful framework for having thought experiments and comparisons and a starting point. Remember, though, that the type may evolve over time, right? So a great example would be something like Etsy, which really started out with both, in some ways, both a social mission and a social primary market impact. and has evolved over time as, for example, it took venture capital and it became necessary to adapt what the organization was trying to accomplish. So do keep in mind that this is not static. Where you type a social venture can change. The typology is a little bit challenging because our understanding of what a social versus economic market impact might vary, or our perspective on its mission might vary. But broadly speaking, the idea behind a social purpose venture is that it's a for-profit venture that is trying to resolve a non-business problem, where the venture is primarily driven by economic drivers for the founders. If there wasn't this economic opportunity for the founders, then they probably wouldn't have started the venture in the first place, even though it is intended to have some social impact. An enterprising nonprofit is where you have a venture that is primarily targeted for social purposes, both from its mission and its market impact. And there are multiple variants of this, such as venture philanthropy and earned income mechanisms for ventures, where it's only designed to kind of keep the organization afloat. The book talks about social consequence ventures that are meant to be for profit, but they have a greater impact on a non-business issue than specifically economic outcomes for the owners. So these focus primarily on social outcomes. They're intended to generate economic impact, but it's mostly a byproduct. And then, of course, there's the traditional ventures, which are for-profit ventures focused on economic impact. Recognize that these can still have social outcomes, right? So they can create jobs, they can ultimately have charitable contributions, and they may have implicit some aspect of social mission or social market impact, but ultimately these organizations are designed to maximize returns to shareholders. So there are limitations to this typology, and one of the key ones which I like to talk about with students is recognizing that there are an awful lot of ways that you can measure impact or measure our social component. Are we assessing intentions, or processes, or outcomes? So, for example, Walmart has a goal of reducing 1 gigaton of greenhouse emissions in its supply chain by 2030. So, does that make it a social venture because it's trying to reduce greenhouse emissions? If we look at this purely from a process or outcome perspective, we might argue that it is a social venture. But I think from a common sense perspective, we would be hard put to claim that Walmart was, in its intentions, a fundamentally social venture. It's clearly a for-profit organization designed to maximize profit to shareholders. So we need to be careful about how we measure these things. And there isn't a definitive answer here. There's no single categorization by intentions, processes, or outcomes that we can then say this, by definition, is a social venture. And so while we want to recognize that typing a venture helps clarify the real motivations of the founders, which can help avoid conflicts later, even that's not necessarily sufficient to be definitive about what a social venture is. As an alternate example, consider the case of Tom's Shoes, which you may be familiar with, which was a social venture created in order to enable providing free shoes to children in rural Argentina. And by many metrics, Tom's Shoes has been successful. There's a successful organization, and it's provided countless pairs of shoes to children who otherwise had to walk to and from school or to and from the well without shoes on. Ironically, there's been one negative outcome associated with it, which is that in many of the small rural villages in Argentina, one of the best jobs to have was to be a cobbler. That is, you made shoes. And many of those individuals were unintentionally put out of business by the Tom's Shoes venture. And so if we look at that from an outcome perspective, that's clearly a negative outcome. Is it worth it in the balance? That's a great question, but social venturing typologies and these kinds of metrics don't provide good ways of addressing that. In the context of social ventures, we still want to recognize capital markets and stakeholders. So social ventures, like any other venture, may need external capital. organizations sometimes require startup capital, they might require growth capital, but there may be inherent limitations in the returns that these kinds of organizations can provide to investors, which then begs the question of what is it that investors really want? Do they simply trying to get an internal rate of return, or is there something else that they're trying to accomplish? And that leads us to a variety of non-traditional funding options, such as impact investment funds, which are specifically set up to have a non-financial impact as a return, local community funds, which are focused on social and economic outcomes in a local community, microfinance, which was made most famous by Eunice and Grameen Bank, providing microloans in underserved capital markets, crowdfunding, of course, which you may be familiar with already, and new options for funding such as blockchain and tokens. So there are a variety of capital market options out there beyond traditional finance for for-profit organizations, but all of these kinds of capital markets and opportunities carry various limitations with them. And so it's important to understand a little bit about each of these in the event that either you're going to be asked to evaluate a social venture or you choose to start a social venture, and recognize the distinction between these and traditional capital funding mechanisms. And that brings us to then stakeholders. The Mitchell stakeholder typology is a really nice one provided in your textbook. And the point about stakeholder typologies and stakeholder theory is simply that not all stakeholders are equal. And we might like to have a framework in which we claimed that all stakeholders should be treated equally, but of course that simply belies the reality of running and managing an organization. And so this particular typology focuses on power, legitimacy, and urgency. That is, how much power does the stakeholder have, how much legitimacy does the stakeholder have, and how urgently will the stakeholder treat the situation. And so the point being that based on your assessment of each type of stakeholder, you can then choose how to treat them, whether they are a definitive stakeholder that requires you to be fully engaged in their involvement, or whether they are a stakeholder who is only demanding, that is, they don't have power or legitimacy, but they have very urgent demands, or whether they're, for example, a dominant stakeholder with power and legitimacy, but no actual urgency associated with what their needs are. And this simply provides you with a mechanism for thinking about how you treat them, how much information you provide them, and how closely you engage them in the decision-making process. They're all customers in one way, shape, or form, but we don't treat all customers the same, and the same thing is true of stakeholders. And that leads us to thinking then more broadly about the global context. So not just social entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship in general is a global phenomenon, but it does look different around the world. There's a couple of key lessons that you can take away from understanding entrepreneurship in a global context, especially as your textbook develops it. One is the core distinction between necessity and opportunity-driven entrepreneurship. If you are part of this course, you are probably part of an opportunity economy, which means that you won't be driven to be an entrepreneur by desperate need. There are many countries in the world with high rates of entrepreneurship where it's necessity driven because there simply aren't other options. But in most of the United States, that's not the case. So I do want you to understand these larger economic contexts, the difference between, say, a factory economy and an innovation economy. And I also want you to recognize how entrepreneurship and gender interplay in different economic contexts. It's very, very important to recognize that while, for example, in the United States, the majority of entrepreneurs are male, that is not an indication that men make better entrepreneurs. It is an indication of the structural framework in which entrepreneurship takes place. And for a long time, it was quite difficult for women to access capital markets, or even in some cases to legally own property. So we need to recognize how entrepreneurship and gender interconnect, both in the United States and in other countries around the world. And then finally, recognize what the drivers of entrepreneurial action are and how they differ a little bit across countries. So the key drivers at the macroeconomic level are access to finance, government regulations, or lack thereof in some countries. Maybe education. Some of the ways that education drive entrepreneurship are not quite as straightforward as we might like. Elements of R&D activity and transfer. Legal infrastructure plays a critical role. Regulatory frameworks such as the FDA in the United States, which regulates healthcare, therapeutics. Physical infrastructure, roads make a big difference. And then cultural and social norms. So a quick note on GEM in this course. You should understand what the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor is as described in the textbook and what it's trying to measure. It's trying to measure how much entrepreneurial activity there is around the world. And you should understand differences across economies and generally across nations. I'm not expecting you to memorize, TEA percentages for any given country, but you do need to see what these large-scale trends are, and you need to understand what it is that the GEM is measuring at sort of a high level. Finally, I want to just make some quick comments. We talk about social entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship itself is a fundamentally social activity. It's an engagement with both other people and the economy and society. And we need to recognize that it's not inherently good or bad, ethical or unethical. There are people out there who are going to say things like, oh, entrepreneurship is inherently good, it's inherently ethical, it's the core important driver of economic activity. It is certainly a driver of economic activity, but to label it as inherently good misses the point. Entrepreneurship includes drug dealers, sex traffickers, and terrorists. Entrepreneurship is a process, and processes can be good or bad. The context and level of analysis matter, and there are always trade-offs. No matter how you look at these situations, there are always going to be trade-offs. Just looking at things like economic growth and job creation and wealth creation, those tend to have both good and bad outcomes. And I really want you to be more sophisticated than what you might see in sort of popular media about both entrepreneurship and wealth creation. And so my comment to you is that I hope that to the extent that you find topics from this course, frameworks and tools interesting, you choose to be entrepreneurial. And I think choosing to have an entrepreneurial mindset makes you a more powerful thinker. And I ask you to then use that for good rather than evil. Make the world a slightly better place by employing some of the entrepreneurial skills and capabilities that we develop in this course.